hoping to do is to give you a crash course into the concept of belonging in a very, very short amount of time. And so we are going to find that it will feel fast, but I hope to give you a generalizable framework that you all can apply in your own domains and in your own realms. Now, I spend an excessive amount of time thinking about these things. It's an unhealthy amount of time. My brother likes to joke that I have an attention condition called APHD, whereby I focus on too little things for way too long, and I hope you're not going to be plagued by this as well. But it is a joy to be here to talk to you about something that I've been thinking about for a long time, which is this concept of belonging. And more, I've been sort of a nerd about the concept of belonging and the research of belonging. But in the past few years, I've kind of feel like the belle of the ball, because what we know, and I'll share with you some data, is that belonging matters, and it matters in important ways in terms of predicting persistence, performance, well-being. And for a long time, a lot of my work has been focused in the educational space. Well, it turns out that as we're thinking about the workforce and how it is that we can promote more retention, better well-being, all of a sudden the workforce is now saying, hey, we want to know how to foster belonging in our workplaces. And so I've been invited to a lot of these events and sharing with you what I've learned and also what I've picked up from various conversations engaging with folks like you all. Now, if I do my job correctly, and I probably won't, I'll achieve 3 goals. One is to give you a very broad sense of the origin of what belonging is, where it comes from, and why it matters. We'll then dive into how it is that we can measure belonging. And then the third, hopefully, we'll give you some strategies for fostering belonging in your own domains. Now, belonging, what does it mean? If you've had a rough morning, I hope that you can sort of take a moment and take joy in the fact that when you look around, we as humans are the most dominant species on the planet. You may not feel that way on a day-to-day basis, but the fact is that we are, and this is a result of a lot of interesting things. Largely, it's driven by the fact that over millions of years, our singular most adaptive trait has been our increasingly growing brain. Relative to our other features, we've sort of expanded the capacities of our brains in order to survive, and that's served us well. But interestingly enough, as you think about that unique characteristic, from an evolutionary perspective, it's an interesting gamble, because as our brains have developed, it also has meant that we are born into this life almost useless. Can't even hold up that giant brain that we've been given. We can't feed ourselves. We can't fend for ourselves. And yet here we are as the dominant species on the planet. How does that work out? Well, the only way that works out is 2 things, actually. One is that we're born pretty darn adorable, which matters because the only way that we can survive as a species, and we take this for granted, is that we are born within a group or a context that guarantees that we will be taken care of, that guarantees that someone will take us into their clan, feed us, protect us, nourish us, sacrifice for us. Without that condition, we would not survive. So the very essence of belonging is woven into the nature of our existence, even to this day. No matter how smart we think we are, we would not be here without the preconditions of belonging. Now, I'll also argue that belonging is one of those things that follows us through life, that we end up doing the things where we feel we belong. It's not just a sort of basic developmental issue. It's something that follows us throughout our lives. And as we think about this, and think about what it is that it means to belong. Now, I've been doing research on belonging for about 15 years. And I hate to share this bad news with you, but over this time, I still haven't found a singular measure of belonging that is accurate in different contexts for different groups at different times. So what does that mean? It means that it's hard to measure. But the one definition of belonging that I do think works really well is the following, is that belonging is the feeling that you are cared for and are valued. And I want to underscore, underline, bolden, double click on the feeling, because it's exactly that. It's the individual, subjective feeling that you are cared for and valued. Why I want to emphasize the word feeling is because I can't stand up here and give you a checklist of things that you can do that will naturally and automatically foster a sense of belonging. Belonging is, by its nature, an individual subjective experience that only exists within the individual. So maybe as a quick exercise, with a show of hands, as you all think about your own day-to-day work, with a number of fingers from 1 to 5, just sort of share with me from 1 to 5, how much do you feel like you belong in your place of work on a scale of 1 to 5? Now, with the same hand or a different hand, if you're tired already, how happy or engaged and fulfilled do you feel at work? Now, you may or may not have noticed this, and of course there's selection bias here, but you all are here because you're a unique group. But there is probably a pretty strong correlation between those two constructs, whether you feel like you belong and how happy and engaged you feel. And that's what I'm going to be diving into today. And I don't know how much time I'll have to do this, but essentially as we think about belonging, it is this fundamental need. And a nice way that I like to think about how belonging is defined, if the graphics work, is that belonging is the longing to be, right? And I started off by saying that belonging is the sort of precondition by which our species survives. But as you think about what belonging continues to be in our day-to-day lives, it is the longing to be. Why that matters is because who we are, if I were to ask you, who are you? Chances are you would give me your name, you would give me some kind of title that goes with what you do, and that's how you define yourselves. And the interesting thing is that we all have multiple identities. I am standing here, I'm a presenter. I drove in here from Pittsburgh. I'm a driver. I've got kids. I'm a parent. I put on my running shoes. I'm a runner. And all of these identities are things that I formed over time. And that's how I see myself. And so as we think about belonging, it really is intricately connected to how it is that we see ourselves. This quote is not showing up very well, but a great quote by Maya Angelou that says that I long, as does every human being, to be a home wherever I find myself. So let's dive into this concept a little bit more. Now, I mentioned that belonging is an entirely subjective experience, but actually one of the best ways to think about belonging is not through its presence, but through its absence. It's usually when belonging is questioned, uncertain, or absent that we really start to see its symptoms of how it is that things go poorly. So, again, a great quote by Brené Brown says that in the absence of love and belonging, there will always be suffering. Another way of doing this, and maybe what I'll get you to do, is in this moment, very briefly, I'll get you to feel what it's like not to belong. So if you'll sort of indulge me, if you will all hold your breath for a second. Now I'm going to ask you to continue to hold your breath for the rest of my presentation. But that's essentially what we're asking people to do when they don't have a sense of belonging. At its core, again, it's one of those fundamental needs. Like oxygen, if you don't have one of your basic core needs fulfilled, I can't expect you to listen to me. I can't expect you to function. I can't expect you to be able to absorb and digest and interact in an optimal way. And we lose sight of that because for the most part, we often find ourselves in places where we do have that sense of belonging, but it's also important to note that we avoid places where we don't feel like we belong. And so as we think about the context that we create as employers, as educators, the people that we see in the room are the ones that already have, hopefully to a certain extent, that sense of belonging. But what else can we do for new individuals coming into that context? What do we need to be paying attention to so that everybody feels like oxygen, they have their core need of belonging fulfilled? Now, I might sort of skip over this part a little bit, which is sort of a list of all the benefits and impacts of belonging. So there's a lot of data showing that when you don't feel like you belong, especially in the workforce, that bad things happen. And interestingly enough, it's actually a pretty large proportion of people who report feeling like they don't belong or they feel isolated. So here, there's 40% of people say that they feel isolated at work, and that the result has been lower organizational commitment and engagement. So a great quote that captures this well says, "I get paid well to do something I enjoy, and I'm surrounded by clever, funny, like-minded people. And for 45 or 50 hours every week, I feel isolated." And these are the conditions in which we find ourselves. And as you think about what that experience might result, as you might guess, that belonging really is associated, as you showed yourselves, with a lot of positive outcomes like increased performance, lower turnover, fewer sick days, greater willingness to engage, more raises, more promotions, and at the end of the day, some pretty significant financial consequences for the organization. So what are the levers of belonging? I've kind of shared what it is. I've kind of showed some data on what the consequences are, but where can you find belonging starts to unfold? And I'll share with you that the kinds of levers and triggers of belonging are a lot more subtle than we might realize. So signals and cues of belonging are everywhere. We are designed to belong. That means we're also designed to be very vigilant for signs of whether or not we feel like that we do belong or not. If you've ever been a presenter, you'll know that you're always scanning the room to see who's paying attention, who's nodding off. If you ever walk into a party, you'll know whether people are welcoming you. And the same is true for every new environment that we go into, but the cues are subtle. The cues are really subtle. And the reason is that part of the problem is that reality is very subjective, and it's not always the same for different people. Now, with a show of hands, when you look at this picture, how many people see a duck or a bird? How many people see a rabbit? Now, same picture, same group, but different perceptions across the room. Now, what's interesting also is that when they've done this research, they've manipulated something important, which is that depending on when this picture is shown, you can also predictably see the different things at different times. So if they show this picture around Easter Sunday, you're more likely to see the rabbit. If they show it closer to Thanksgiving, you're more likely to see the duck. The only time I've ever seen this example fail is when I was at the University of Oregon, where everybody saw the duck, because that's their mascot. But otherwise, it's pretty reliable. And this is important to note because as you think about the cues of belonging, as I mentioned, they can be incredibly subtle. So here's some really interesting data and research that shows just how subtle they can be. In one study, what they did is they invited women and men into the lab, and as part of this lab experiment, they said, "You're about to go and fill out some surveys, but before you do, would you mind hanging out in this TA's office just while we sort of get you started?" And so for a few minutes, the participants waited in this room. And the room, as you would imagine, because it's a computer science program, had a lot of things that you would expect in a TA's room, which is like pop cans, some sci-fi books, a sci-fi poster on the wall. You wouldn't bat an eye at this. Now, in the other condition, they replaced these items with slightly more neutral elements. So a water bottle, more neutral pictures, more neutral books. And what they wanted to see is for the men and women who are coming into the lab, who are computer science first-year students, was to ask them, after they were exposed to this one of the two rooms by randomized, how much they felt they belonged or were interested in computer science. And what they found was that the men were generally not affected by this, but women who were wondering if this is a place where I can belong, if this is a place where I can potentially succeed, if they had been placed in the stereotypical room before doing the experiment, before doing the research, then they reported lower sense of belonging and lower sense of interest in computer science. Very, very subtle cues that have powerful effects in terms of your mindset that gets you started in a new environment. Now, another example that's, I think, relevant to the workforce is as we think about job applications, what is the language that we use? So my colleagues from the University of Waterloo had a phenomenal study where they did a pretty comprehensive sweep of job applications on these online portals. And they looked for the presence of certain kinds of words. The words were either male dominant or male stereotypical or female stereotypical words. And what they found, the graphic's not showing, but essentially they found a higher prevalence of male dominant words like leader, executive, and dominant in some of these job applications compared to female stereotypical words that included interpersonal, relational, caring. And before anybody actually took a job, men and women were asked, how interested are you in taking a role in the company? And as you would expect, women showed less interest to be in the workplaces where there were male dominant words. So even before we invite people, we are signaling to them that this is a place for you or is not a place for you. Another example of, I think, where signals of belonging happen, and this is outside of the language, it's outside of the cues, but it's in the processes that we have. Another great study from my colleague, Stephanie Reeves and David Yeager, essentially what they did, and we've all had this happen, right? We've all gone to a web page and they ask us to fill out a form before we have access to whatever magical content we're promised. Now, in this web form, they will ask you, if you're a first-time user, to fill out your name, fill out some information, create a password, and then that will be your login. Now, as I've mentioned, we've all had the experience where you fill it out, and what ends up happening is after you filled out a password, then you get an error message saying, sorry, this password does not meet the secret criteria that we had for you, but we never told you. And so either you change your password, or in the other condition, we erase everything, so you have to fill it out and you change your password. Now, as we all know, it's a very frustrating experience if you're in the condition where they delete everything compared to the condition where they don't delete everything. But importantly, what does that mean if you're a first-gen student, for example, who is trying to figure out whether college is a place for you? And again, this is a controlled study in the lab. But for first-gen students, after they were in the condition where the entire form was erased and they had to go through and refill everything, in their minds they're coming with a question of, is this a place where I will belong? And if encountering a simple form that I can't even fill out, how do I hope to complete college? How do I hope to succeed in this place if I can't even fill out this simple form? So the processes that we have are also signaling to the individuals in our communities whether this is a place for you. It's procedural hassles have a big role in the way that we feel like we do or don't belong. Sorry, there we go. Hard to see this graph behind it. But essentially, that's exactly what they found. So first-gen students, if they were in the form that deleted everything, reported much less sense of belonging in the environment and interest in the program as well. So I don't want to be too dire. I do want to share some good news, possibly. And the good news is that because perceptions of belonging are based on the ambiguities of the environment, there's a lot of subjective reality that we construe on a day-to-day basis. It's also to be mindful of the ways that maybe we signal that you don't belong and ways in which we can foster belonging. So I'm going to share with you some very, very brief examples, but my hope is that you leave here with a generalizable knowledge of where belonging comes under question so that you can create the conditions where belonging is fostered. Lots of filler slides. So the one thing that I will recommend off the bat is that you don't do this. You don't create a billboard or welcome videos or whatever it is, an onboarding guide for new employees saying you belong. Because by doing that, you're actually placing the onus on the individual. You're saying, now that I've told you that you do belong, it's on you to show me that you belong. It's your responsibility. It's no longer on me. I've sort of washed my hands. And that does not work. Also, because belonging is very popular right now, there will be more campuses that are going to be sharing this message to students hundreds of times before a student even sets foot on campus, to the point where the student's going to be saying, why am I being told that I belong so many times? Maybe I don't belong, and they're trying to convince me that I do. So explicitly saying that you do belong doesn't work out, unfortunately. If you have children, you're very well familiar with the fact that what you ask is not what you get. And so how can you foster belonging? Well, one of the things that is important is, again, to anchor your work and understanding around the recognition that people come into new environments constantly questioning whether they do or don't belong. And as you transition into a new role, as you transition into a new environment, these questions are the most salient. Before you have a sense of really getting your bearings in a new environment, you're questioning, do I or do I not belong? And so you're going to have questions around uncertainties. You're going to have questions around the meaning of difficulties. You're going to have questions around navigating processes. And if left to your own devices, you might conclude that these are signals that I don't belong. But what you can possibly do as a context creator is help the individual recognize three very important things. First of all, that challenges and uncertainties are a normal part of any transition. It's not that you are inefficient or inadequate or this is not a place for you, but anyone who transitions is going to have these uncertainties. These are normal and common. It's also normal because it's not a reflection of your deficiencies. Transitions are the cause of the uncertainties. Transitions are the cause of feeling like you're struggling. So it's common. You're not the only one, even though you feel that way. It's normal as part of the transition. And if you've ever had your heart broken, you know that the greatest pain comes in feeling like this will last forever. And so what you need to also convey is that these uncertainties will pass with time. And so in randomized controlled trials, where we have scaled across multiple institutions, we share these sort of testimonials from upperclassmen to incoming freshman students. And the stories are very, very almost benign. They say, when I first came to college, I felt uncertain, I had some challenges, but then I realized that these are common experiences and that they pass with time. Literally what I just mentioned to you. And being exposed to these messages, these interventions, significantly reduced underperformance gaps. They significantly improve well-being. They significantly improve performance and persistence. Simply by coming into a new environment with a lens that helps people realize that what I'm feeling right now in this transition is not a reflection that I can't do this. This is a normal experience that everybody goes through. And so I know that these things will pass with time, and I will be able to avail myself to the resources, to the peer connections, to the environment, which in turn will create that sense of belonging. But as you're first transitioning, you don't know if you will be accepted in this place, and so knowing that these uncertainties pass with time are critical. The other area that I might mention is worth thinking about, as I alluded to earlier, messaging and language actually is pretty critical. So how do we take that into account? And I wonder if I want to share this with you. Maybe not. I'll pass on this. I have less time than I thought. Okay, this is a really fun study. So here's another study that I think, I'm a nerd though, so maybe you all don't think this is fun. But this is another study that shows you the power of the question of belonging and certainty, and how you can cultivate messaging that is more psychologically attuned. So my colleagues, my mentor actually, Jeffrey Cohen, and some of his colleagues did this study where they asked teachers to essentially do what they do on a daily basis. So if you're a teacher and your task is to help students learn, you get their homework, and your responsibility is to give them feedback. Now, this is called the mentor's dilemma, because you want that feedback to help them grow, but you also don't want that feedback to cripple them. You don't want it to crush their souls, essentially, right? And when a student, interestingly enough, gets their paper back and it looks like this, they don't think, oh, how kind of my teacher to have spent their Sunday afternoon really sort of poring over what I had created because they want me to learn and grow. Instead, they think, oh, they spent their Sunday afternoon pooping on my paper because they don't think I'm smart enough. That's what they think. That's the question that is looming in their minds, and they're wondering why so much feedback. And for us as employers, we have to give feedback as well. And so how do we manage that? Well, what they did was they collected the paper feedback from all of the teachers that they had in the study, and before they handed the papers back to the students, they attached one of two sticky notes, the researchers did. So the teachers did what they did, but the researchers attached one of two versions of the sticky note on the paper before the student got the paper back. And on the one version, it says that I'm giving you these comments so that you have feedback on your paper, which is basically saying nothing at all, right? It's like, why'd you even bother writing that? On the other condition, what they wrote is like, I'm giving you these comments. So it's the other one. Okay, here we go. On the other version of the sticky note, it says, I'm giving you these comments because I have high standards and I know that you can achieve them or meet them. Now, again, as you think about the question that the student is posing, the question that the student is asking themselves is, why am I getting this feedback? Is it because I think the teacher thinks I'm dumb? Or is it because I think the teacher wants to help me grow? Well, what you can do as employers, as teachers, is you can essentially very specifically and explicitly tell them what your intentions are and why you're investing your time, because absent that, when people are left to navigate with the questions of, do I belong, unfortunately, our tendencies are to create defense mechanisms, to want to protect ourselves when we don't know for sure that we do belong. And so that means that we tend to err on the side of concluding that we don't belong. So in order to circumvent that, you as employers, as educators, need to articulate explicitly that you are giving them this feedback because you do believe that they can meet your expectations. And I also want to point out that it's not about lowering standards. Actually, there's a lot of value in having high standards. It's about conveying that I have these high standards because I believe you can achieve them. And that's a very different message than when you're not conveying exactly what the meaning of this message is. So, those are, again, just sort of some teasers, some very quick samples of the kind of ways that you can take this framework and apply it in your own work and in your own interactions with employees, with students. I will share that my lab, WG Labs, has been doing this work for a long time. And we think that one of the ways in which you can really comprehensively capture whether there is a sense of belonging is through this framework of assess, design, and scale. And we have a bunch of services that we're always happy to share with you all. So if you're interested, please reach out. But essentially, it matters that you first start to measure whether your individual groups do feel like they do or don't belong. And then you design an intervention based on exactly where the uncertainty of belonging happens. Is it in a process point? Is it in an application point? Is it in an interaction point? Once you have that understanding, you can design it and then hopefully scale those kinds of programs. Now, one little bit of, I guess, guidance I'll give you is if you all are, any of you managers in this room? Do you manage folks? Okay. So when I first came across this, it was helpful for me because if you know the Peter principle, it's basically this notion that if you're good at something, you're going to be promoted into incompetence, which is another way of saying that you're going to be promoted to the point of being a manager and you're no longer doing the thing that you were good at. And that's definitely been the case for me. I'm now the director of learning innovation at WG Labs, which means that I oversee the work of other people and do very little work of my own. But what it does mean is that I manage a team. And it's a relatively new domain for me. I'm a researcher by training. I don't know how to manage people. And when I first came into this role, I actually went through this evolution myself. First, it was about survival. As a manager, how do I make sure that I am sort of checking off the box of performance so that I can do what I need not to get fired? And generally, that's not a great way of managing, right? After a little bit of time, I then had enough confidence to think about, all right, how do I manage from a team-focused perspective? Which is to say, how do I prioritize my team's goals, my team's experiences, so that they feel satisfied and they view me positively? Now, this was a little bit better, but it's still the symptoms of someone who's just starting out and flexing their management muscle. because there are some flaws in this. When you're handed down a task to share with your team, you say, oh, I don't want to do this either, but we've got to do it, right? Or, I really want you to not be disappointed or upset with me, so let me let you carve out what you think is important in your work. And again, well-intended, but it's an approach of management that may still be limited. The third, and I would suggest the optimal way of managing is this organization-focused management, which is to say that you are able to inspire your team and connect their work to the broader organization's goal. So you're not saying, oh, we've got to do this on a Sunday afternoon because I've been told to do it. You're saying, we're doing this because at the organization, these are the things that we strive for. These are the things that we think are important, and you're part of that mission. So long term, this is probably the best strategy. And as you're thinking about your management styles, where does it fit in? And can there be a way in which you can sort of make sure that you're linking what your individual teams are doing to the organizational goals? So that was just one little tidbit. I do want to, again, share with you or remind you that there's all of these levers that you can pull on as you're thinking about fostering belonging. That includes your representation. If you are looking at your group and your organization and there isn't diversity, you may have a hard time convincing an underrepresented individual that this is a place where they belong. So what are the things that you can do from a representation perspective? What are the things that you can do from a process and structures perspective? What are the things that you can do from a vision and mission? So these are the ways in which you can articulate and clarify the why of what your organization is doing so that the individuals know how their work is related to the organization. And then finally, messaging. How are you communicating to your individuals? What I also want to leave you with is this challenge. I think as you think about your employees, your students, you might recognize that belonging is the feeling that you are cared for and valued. And my goal for you would be to create an experience in which your individuals within your teams don't say that I chose to come here, I chose to work here, I chose to come to University of Tennessee, but instead, University of Tennessee chose me. My organization chose me. And if you can achieve that level, if you can get to the point where your employees, your students are saying, this is a place that chose me, then you will have succeeded. So with that, I'll thank you. I will also share my LinkedIn QR code. If any of this is relevant, if there's resources that you're interested in, if you'd like to continue the conversation, please whip out your phone and do a quick scan. But I'm not sure if I have time for questions.
Well, no, you do. So while people are scanning the LinkedIn, we have time for one, maybe two. Please keep your questions brief. But yes, we do have a few minutes. Okay, hold
on. I'm thinking about predominantly white institutions and minoritized folks who are in leadership positions or coaches or those advising students who have also felt a sense of exclusion on campus at PWIs. And they're talking to students who are also, Black or brown students. And, there's this balance that you have to strike because you know what it feels to be othered. And, students are experiencing feeling othered. And so how do you balance that? How do you balance that advice that you give to students when you yourself are experiencing there are politics to belonging, right? And so if you're feeling excluded in these spaces, in these educational spaces.
Yeah, great and very, very tough question. Can I get another question? No, I'm just checking. Yeah, that's a tough one. I mean, as I mentioned, it's hard to convey that you belong when the representation doesn't confirm that. If you sit in a classroom and you are literally one of two people of your group and across an ocean of people who don't look like you, then you feel like the token individual. You actually feel a lot of that stereotype threat, which is Claude Steele's work, that adds a layer of tax to everything that you do. It's sort of constantly draining at you. And it's a very difficult thing. There's also institutions where I've been to, unfortunately, where the uncertainty about belonging is not this implicit, unintended thing. It's actually overt and explicit. So in those environments, I would say there's so much you can do. But for the most part, that is not the case. For the most part, the institutions are well-intended, and the challenge is that as humans, we naturally go towards the groups that we think we're similar to, just by design, how we function. I will give you that as a metaphor and as a strategy that you can potentially generalize. So when I have lectures, one of the first things, especially when I do group work or I want the class to interact, is I try to find a dimension of belonging that is universal and not based on one of those demographic variables. And that's really all it takes. It's called mere belonging. You want to be with people where you feel like there's a shared similarity, because that conveys that maybe this is a person that will share my values. And it doesn't take much. You can actually pretty powerfully manipulate that perception of shared similarity on a singular point of similarity. So as an example, when I do my classes at the beginning of the year, what I'll do is I'll lay out different Skittle colors at the front of the class, and I'll ask people to go to their favorite color of Skittles. And that transcends some of the demographic variables. And what I'm doing there is I'm creating an overarching identity that is unifying, that goes beyond the dimension in which we separate ourselves. And I think as an institutional leader, you can think about what are the overarching identities that we can lean into, and then also contact theory. I think the way that people engage and connect with others is through exposure. And so it's convenient, sometimes feels safe to stay within your own group, but what are the affordances, the expectations for you to interact with others outside of your group? To your question, if you're a mentor and you're trying to convey to someone that you can fit in, I will also share that from what I've seen, a pretty significant proportion of the variance of belonging uncertainty and the harmful effects of belonging are not objective belonging cues, but it's the subjective perceptions that people have to navigate. So that's confirmation that as a coach, you can say what you're going through is normal. What you're going through will pass, and you will find a way that either is connected to others or the strategies or the processes to succeed here. The other thing I'll say is it's incredibly important to have representation among those mentors, because I think it's called the Obama effect. When President Obama came into power, we saw pretty significant increases in students of color going into higher ed, going into more leadership roles, because there is a proof of concept. So faculty and mentors who demonstrate to me that I can do this thing that I never thought was possible is immensely powerful. So as you're talking to those mentors, tell them to keep up the great work, don't get discouraged, and convey to them that these things are challenging, but that human connection and an understanding that it is a shared human experience is critical.
Omid, and I think for the group here, I think you can understand why we asked him to speak, because I think every single one of us is thinking about our students and the notion of belonging and the cadre and even our own staff succession. So, Omid, I'm really looking forward to continuing to explore in our partnerships this and how it translates to our students. But I also want to give a shout out because you've built a pretty awesome team. And I would say, in addition to your work, I am just so impressed with the depth that you have. You basically took some great folks across the country and put them in the lab, which I think was very genius, I would say. But you've done a lot of work on the workforce connection. So their team understands some of these other forces that we're talking about during our conference today. And so I wonder if you can do just a very quick, what other research and work that you've been doing specifically around the workforce outcome.
So there's a lot. Our lab, as I mentioned, basically encompasses 3 branches. We do research. And so as I mentioned, the suite of services that we've now been extending into the workforce are growing in popularity. So as workforces are trying to do an equity audit, is what we call it, is to scan whether or not there is equity, there's a sense of belonging. We have the survey instruments that have been validated and scaled that will give you a sense of, is this context that I've created actually aligned with what I think I've created? We are also working with managers and conducting what we call a 360. It's almost like a consulting way of getting feedback from your individual contributors and direct reports to give you a sense of how you're performing and achieving at these standards. And finally, we're also doing a lot of work in terms of the design of programs, messaging, interventions that foster these areas of belonging. So there's a research group that does that suite of work. We're also, as an accelerator group, we have investments in technologies and companies that are doing great things. So there's only so much that we can do as an individual organization, but we're investing in organizations and products that are doing this kind of work, that are connecting students to workforce opportunities, that are prioritizing students' financial ability to afford college and think about the transition to the workforce, that are equipping them with the skills to be able to succeed in those environments. And generally, we're trying to share. So me being here is an example of being able to share what we've learned. And what I'm able to share is the result of what I've learned elsewhere. So it's part of this work as well. So I'm really, I think, proud to say that we're doing a lot of work in that transition and increasingly in the focus on the workforce environment. But I probably don't have time to go into all of the details here. Happy to stay connected and share more details.
Thank you, Omid, so much. And like he said, please do connect with our speakers and continue the conversation.